Welcome. We're Robert and Suzanne Mays. We have been researching NDEs since 2005. Today, we're interviewing Stephen Robbins, who has had 8 NDEs over his lifetime, starting with his birth in 1944. Stephen is rabbi of the congregation Neve Shalom in Los Angeles. He is also co-founder of the Academy for Jewish Religion in California, the first trans-denominational rabbinic and cantorial school. Stephen is a clinical psychologist with a specialty in the psychoneuroimmunology of trauma. Today, we want to speak with Stephen about his most recent NDEs. There he saw the pain, sorrow, and anger in the people who had died from the pandemic, many dying alone and in shock at having to go before their time. Stephen saw that there needs to be reconciliation with those who have caused this needless suffering and death. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you for the invitation.
Stephen, your latest NDEs happened in 2020 during the pandemic.
Yes.
During those 2 NDEs, you got specific insights about the pandemic and the effects it had on those who died. What were some of your observations and insights?
As I transited this time, it was very different than the prior ones. It was very dark and filled with a great deal of anguish. My life review was very brief, and it was, in a sense, a preparation looking at the anguish I had gone through in my life, as well as the anguish of my ancestors, the anguish of my wife's family who were Holocaust survivors, and others who had gone through similar issues of survival. So that and I was completely confused by it because all of my prior near-death experiences had been filled with a great deal of life and a sense of relief and confidence. And instead, this one was filled with a sense of anguish, confusion, which I then realized wasn't mine in the sense of my experience, but was something waiting for me. When I arrived at the place in which we encounter the souls which are waiting for us as we transit what would be called the tunnel or the process of life review and transformation, what I came upon was this startling scene, and I'm using the word scene as if I was seeing something because it's the limitations of vocabulary in this world. But what I did was I experienced the presence of several 100,000 souls which had died needlessly in the pandemic, most of them from the United States, but others from other places around the world, and who had died needlessly because there was medicine available or because medicine was being withheld or because the pandemic, more importantly, was not being taken seriously, especially in this country. And so there was this sense that while people could have either been protected from it or saved from it or responded to, these souls felt that they had been cast away. Some felt that it was intentional. Many of them, black and brown, since they were poor, had been cast away because they no longer fit the image of what people in the United States ought to look like. Others because they were poor and uneducated, and others because they stood in the way of the development of socioeconomic strata which would emerge healthy from the pandemic. And these people were filled with great shock, surprise, anger, and sorrow because they had died before their time and that they had not had a chance to fulfill what their soul's purpose was in this world because someone else's needs outside of their soul purpose had decided that they were expendable. The anguish, the anger, the even sense of aggression was so palpable, it just overwhelmed me. But was most intense was this feeling of being victimized. The sense of being victimized is so powerful because it entitles one to do almost anything as a result of wanting either justice or revenge. And I was asked to come back and to speak through ions, which we had established in my prior NDE, to begin to express this anguish.
So in this particular spiritual realm of those who had died from the pandemic and also those who had an NDE from the COVID and then returned, what did you observe specifically?
In my sixth NDE, I was somehow warned or informed that something was coming that would kill millions of people. And it was all part of a much larger issue, not just of illness, but of the health of the planet, the disparity between wealth and poverty, education, ignorance, etc. And that the fabric of existence, which had been unfolding since the beginning, was beginning to be torn apart. For us, the meaning of the word evil is the word to disrupt, to take apart that which had been put together. And in my sixth NDE, I had not spoken about my near-death experiences before, but I was informed about an organization named IONS that I had never heard about, and that I was to contact them and send them the message that I had received, that IONS was the one platform in the world that had the information about near-death experiences that could begin to reach out to the world and begin to talk about the nature of near-death experience as real and begin to ameliorate the fear of death. And that if we could ameliorate the fear of death, then we could begin to ameliorate much of the evil that went on in the world, because it's the fear of death that drove most of those who wanted to acquire in order to assuage their fear.
Right.
So I delivered the message through a variety of means, and Chuck Swedrock and Susan Amsden began the development of the ISGO groups, and then you began doing research on how to express the incredible phenomenology that the two of you had developed for all NDEers. And that became the language by which we could then offer to millions who have had NDEs, but had no way to either express it or to share with people who'd understood it. And that was the beginning of what was the seventh and eighth NDE I had, in which the need to speak out was important. It was not just me who was given that message. At that moment, there were other presences of souls to return. It was given to me because I'm a rabbi and therefore can speak about it in other terms. and because as a public figure, people would have a greater tendency to listen to me. Also because I had had so many NDEs previously and had gone through so many of my own illnesses that I had a certain language capacity to describe it. I know that there was a parallel between those who suffered in this pandemic and a parallel with those who suffered in the Holocaust, in that there were millions of people who just ignored it, who paid no attention to it happening, and who acted surprised that it was going on, or who, more importantly, wanted to deny it. So those who denied the Holocaust or other genocides have denied that any of this was happening, especially in America, which was of such enormous pain to those who had died needlessly.
So Stephen, what did you see are the consequences for those who intentionally caused this unnecessary suffering and death during the pandemic? And is there a spiritual process of reconciliation between the perpetrators and the victims?
Yeah, that's among the most important of the messages I learned even in my first NDE. It is the process that you appropriately use the word reconciliation. In Hebrew, the word is teshuvah, which is poorly translated as repentance. It means from the word shuv, to return. It is the process not of repentance and forgiveness, but of reconciliation, which means reestablishment of the damaged relationship, as well as the taking of responsibility for that which was done. And what I learned decades before was that when we go through life review, as we pass through to the next level, that what I experienced is that I saw my life on my terms, but that I was also shown my life as other people saw my life and experienced it. And if you want to talk about hell, that's painful. And then I was shown what it is I was meant to accomplish versus what I did in fulfilling of my soul's purpose, and talk about painful, that was even more painful. So when I got to the place of encountering the souls who I had hurt and those who had hurt me, those first came to me seeking a reconciliation, which meant acknowledging what they had done to me, the motivations that led them to do it, without just blaming me, but their own inner motivations. And then it was my question whether or not I would accept their apology and their truly heartfelt pouring out of their grief at the pain and the sorrow that it had caused me. And when I was able to do that, you could see this enormous burden of anguish, at least in terms of the relationship with me being lifted. And then I was challenged as to whether or not I could cease being a victim, because what I learned in this is that being a victim is one of the most powerful psycho-spiritual positions to take, because then you feel that you're entitled to almost anything, and a victim, if nothing else, can constantly complain. When you give up being a victim, it means that you yourself have to move on to your own healing. The same is true for those who I hurt, who came to me also for healing, and the same process went on so that they were relieved of my power to hurt them.
So what is the spiritual process of releasing oneself from the sense of victimhood so that one no longer feels to be a victim?
Uh, that's a process of experiencing the incredible release from the constriction that took place from the destructive behavior that happened to you, that either closed you down or pulled you apart so that you could not function as a full being. Remember the Zohar, that's our Kabbalistic commentary on Bible, teaches that the body is a shoe for the soul's foot. Therefore, there's only a small amount of our soul present. There are 3 of the 5 dimensions, but the root, the ikar of the soul, is held for us in what's called the storehouse of souls, Otsar Nishamot. And we can only experience that as we pass through this process of reconciliation. There's an additional piece of reconciliation, Suzanne, that I didn't answer. For those who were the cause of these huge destructions of human lives, they have to remain generation after generation, one soul at a time, going through the reconciliation process. So, for example, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, others, Donald Trump, some of the Republicans, etc., who denied all this and who have affected not just the generation that died, but all of their family members and theirs and theirs, and they have the responsibility to take all the pain back. And that means that they will be in this place for a very long time, cleansing the souls that come through from all that they caused. And the closer they get toward the end of their lives, the more they realize that they're facing enormous amounts of their own guilt, which is what I expected Donald Trump is feeling, and has his own fear about the end of his life, though he doesn't know what that means because he is such a narcissist and a sociopath. But like so many people like that who injure others, they think they're justified because they think they're the victims. Those souls have a great debt to pay, and they will pay it for a very long time. It's not hell, because ultimately their souls, which still have a spark of the divine in them, will not be healed until the last soul they've affected comes through, and then they will be finally permitted to transit to the next level of being.
That's that's quite a statement there.
Stephen, what is the supportive role of a person's spiritual guides or protectors, one's shomrim, in this process of reconciliation?
Shomrim, spiritual guides, that's such a huge topic. I discovered them first when I became a soul. Prior to my birth, when the astonishment of being a distinguished essence of being that was not part of the core, the great whole, and there was great fear and great joy and ecstasy and terror. And at first I thought, or I felt, I'm using human terms, quote, alone. And then I realized that I was really a spark of that holy presence in its own distinguished fashion, and that I had work to do to enter into what is, from a Jewish perspective, an incomplete existence that's always unfolding. I didn't know how I was going to move through the various levels of being until I realized that I was, quote, not alone, that there were spiritual beings around me. Now, many people will call them angels. The word in Hebrew from which it derives is the word malach, which literally means a messenger. And they are not independent beings, but they are rather messengers sent by the divine source to serve the purpose of bringing my soul and later other souls, or before that, through the process of entrance into the physical world. And these spiritual beings had no shape, no form, no voices, etc. And as we began the process of moving away from the core, you notice I don't like ascent and descent because that has such judgment qualities to it. But moving outward from the core, those spiritual beings began to take some form that became semi-human. And the wings are, in a sense, a metaphor for the motive process of being able to move anywhere at will. And that as they brought me down through 5 levels of compaction, as it were, so that I could eventually become in physical form, I was joined by ancestors. Some of them are psychogenetic ancestors, those who are in my family line who came before me and who didn't finish their work and whose work I was then to finish. And then another descent line of those in a spiritual realm with whom I shared some spiritual quality. Sometimes those lines are separate and sometimes they converge. And in my case, they converged with me. So I have a descent line that goes back to my great-grandfather in Vitebsk in Belarus in the late 1800s, that then goes back to 1530 to an ancestor buried in Montpellier, then back to southern Spain, etc. So it's a very old family line of rabbis, mystics, and those who support healing, as well as the spiritual descent that goes farther back into biblical times. So that what I learned is that all of us have ancestral characteristics, both genetic and spiritual, that give us the qualities that we have in order to, when we enter into the world at this time and place, it is because we are needed to help take an incomplete existence and move it forward toward more synergy, more wholeness. Synergy meaning that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, not equal to the sum of its parts. So it is this wholeness, or in Hebrew, the word shalom, which generates this sense of the next step of wholeness and completion. So that what we're facing in this huge disruption of the world's existence is the challenge to now choose to move beyond one level of limitation, leave it behind, and in a wholeness, step forward into a new. And that means saving everything and everyone.
So our spiritual guides are helping in this process of reconciliation. And how do they help? How do they help with this process of reconciliation?
What they do is they bring us together, first of all, and they are supportive and calming as the intensity of the reconciliation process begins, because the souls can become so agitated, so full of pain, so themselves out of focus and out of sync, that the spiritual guides end up being holders and containers, and keep, as I put it, whispering in our ears that this is something that we are able to do, and that we are greater than the limitations of our fear. You know, in Hebrew, there are 3 words for fear. There's pachad, which means fear of something in particular. There is ema, which means generalized fear or anxiety and panic. And then yira, which is the word for awe. And it is this ema, this generalized panic of not knowing where things could come from, that the Shomrim help contain, so that instead of living with hope or fear of faith or belief, we live with a sense of confidence that this is something that we can do, because there are others before us and there are others after us which will do this. And this is the way we heal not only this physical level of existence, but the rest of the levels of existence that we will go through before we return back to the original source.
So we know that because of the pandemic and because of certain people's actions, a lot of people have been thwarted in their life, and that has thwarted their life plan. How can there be healing and a way of making whole what has been thwarted in a person's life plan?
First of all, since there is no death, the tikkun, the purpose, the capacity to complete existence doesn't cease. It means it isn't fulfilled at this lowest level of existence, but what they have learned about themselves as a result of the way they've left this world teaches them what it is they have to apply in the next levels of existence to come, so that it's not lost. It does mean that either someone in their family, someone in another level or generation will pick up the work that they did not get to complete. So if you think of not a wire, but of a yarn of thread in which one piece of yarn is hooked to another, souls are hooked one to another as in a skein of yarn, so that we are at the end of a skein and as or a piece of yarn, and that when we leave, another soul will come to hook on, so that we are not the only source that brings completion or wholeness. It is the constant work of all of humanity to do it. And since we live in the most incomplete level of existence, we have severe limitations due to our senses not all working together, our consciousness not all joined together. Frequently, our right brain and left brain are growling at each other and not working together, so that the consciousness of our souls, which exists outside our brain, can't even calm that in order to make it possible for us to serve our purpose. That's amongst the work I do, to teach people how to calm all of that so they can find the core of their centers, their soul's meaning and purpose in the world.
And and so your heritage in mysticism and healing, there are every soul is formed to do one of 3 things, I think you have said.
Yes. Every soul has one of 3 purposes, sometimes all 3. One is to take something out of the world which no longer belongs, either a treatment or a system of genetics which don't belong in the world anymore, or a spiritual quality that can be stopped. The other is to bring something new into the world, of knowledge or experience, an insight that has not been there before. And the third is to do all three. Frequently, many of us, especially those of us in ions on or have had near-death experiences, are meant to do all three, so that in our leaving this world and realizing there is no death, we change the genetic outpour that will stop the repetition of the destructiveness, like drug addiction, child abuse, etc., violence, acquisition, and at the same time will add a sense of insight, understanding, which will lead beyond living with a sense of the limitation in this life. And the third is to synergize both of them. So what comes in is this sense that those of us who have had NDEs are exemplars of what it means to live a life for service and for purpose rather than for our own gain. That's why I never talked about this until a couple of years ago. I never wanted anyone to think I was doing this for my gain or my fame or for some acquisition, or that I was trying to make myself something more than I am, because I'm only in service to that which has formed me to do this. And you and the rest of IONS made it possible for me to speak.
Stephen, how can we help and support the people who've had an NDE from the COVID?
I believe that, and it's the message I got, is that we need to reach out publicly to those people who have survived COVID, to let them know that we have had NDEs. There are even people who've had NDEs from COVID now who are participating in the ISGO groups, and maybe run specific ISGO groups for those who have had COVID, died, and returned, and what that means for them because of the physical or emotional limitations they'll live with, so that they will be able to use that experience, what they've learned, in order to help others. For example, themselves being able to encourage so many others to go get vaccinated so that we can put an end to this pandemic rather than in the stupidity of continuing it by refusing to get vaccinated because of our own individual needs without any regard for the lives of others around us.
And what would you say is the message from NDEs about death that you'd like to share?
Is that there is no reason to be afraid of death. What we call death is only the death of the body, that the soul, the consciousness, the identity never dies, that each of us essentially is eternal because we are a spark of God's presence and therefore cannot die. It is the uniqueness of our spiritual qualities, the talents that we've been given that add to existence itself. And therefore we should live with a sense of gratitude that we've been able to be in this world, as difficult as it is, and that from it we've learned to add to the world that which needs to be added, take away that which needs to be taken away, and take with us in the next levels of the lives that we will live that wisdom so that we can face greater challenges above than we ever envisioned here below.
Right. And those who have died from the pandemic, of course, continue on in spiritual form.
Yes, they do not end. What is their role farther on? I'm not sure. I have not been given to see that or to have been shown what it is. I do know that there is the principle in Kabbalah, so below, so above, so that whatever's going on at this limited level of existence is somehow going on at a much greater level of impact farther on. So those who have left this world in the midst of this pandemic themselves bring a great knowingness that needs to be applied there that can end whatever the disruption is, because the disruption is not just in this world, but continues farther and farther up or out. Excuse my using the wrong term.
Well, thank you very much. I think that that really says it all. There is no death.
Correct. There is only the dying of the body, which is a relief. I remember the first time I had an NDE from a lung collapse because of severe lung damage I had from the Philippine flu, which I got in '85. And in '87, when my lungs collapsed and I had an NDE, it was the startling realization that I didn't have to breathe in order to live. And in each of the other two subsequent lung collapses in '91 and in '05, it was the enormous relief realizing that in order to be, I didn't have to breathe. That generates an enormous awareness that I am and that I'm here. So that the phrase when God calls on the prophets or anyone is, are you here? Are you present? And we respond, Hineni. It is the putting together of two words, Ani, which is I, my unique identity, my unique soul, and Hine, the word here, which is both a place and a time. So it's I am here, here am I, Hineni, and it is that I am not only a unique being, but I am also a place. And because I am a place, I don't have to justify my having a place in this world or a place in the world to come, but I am a necessary place of being, which has its own format.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing these wonderful, deep insights.
Been my honor. I'm very grateful.